Why do you think Christians are so quick to disfellowship over race and social issues?
Let me just give a really short answer, not a long one. Okay. People need to grow up. I think that's one issue. There's a lot of people that they have a clarity about what is right and wrong, but they lack emotional maturity. And so I feel like that's a really small thing. Why? Because I don't know, like we're talking about morality and right and wrong, but we have an emotional maturity that is like a 6-year-old that doesn't allow for healthy dialogue. That's just real quick. That's just one thing. I just say people need to grow up, and myself included. I think I've needed to definitely like evaluate the way that I engage with people. So that's one thing.
Yeah. I think one also is that there are certain denominations that have elevated this issue to a confessional status, and which is not healthy. Instead of resolving their issues and going through the conflict resolution process, there's one side that wants to elevate it to the status of confession. So, and I think some churches will or denominations may be at risk because they're not as strongly as confessional as we are in the Presbyterian circles. So, but I think also American evangelicalism has a tendency for subjective revivalism. So I think that the emotionalism gets in the way of these things as well, But also cultural conformity is an issue, especially I think in the PCA is facing this, seeking the cultural acceptance, seeking their approval. So I think these are barriers for many people, and they separate because of it.
I think were you speaking, bro?
You're good, bro. You're good to speak.
Can't hear you.
You keep touching the mic, bro.
My mic is on.
There, we got you now.
Sorry about that.
Stop touching the mic. You rapping, bro.
Yeah, I'm used to doing like this. My bad. No, I feel like it's a lot of his cultural relevance. This. Whenever, like we say in Spanish, cuando alguien toca la llaguita, the whatever hurts, it hurts. It's a hard thing to deal with, and I feel like in either side of the conversation, cultural relevance takes a big precedence to how you react to it, and an emotional stability, of course. But go ahead, Papano. Are you in the middle of saying something?
No, you're good. I want to make sure your voice is heard. That's all.
Yeah.
I think Aldo hit it. The nail on the hammer, where that saying is, in regards to emotional maturity. I think a lot of people struggle with that in regards to how to deal with this issue. But I also think people are so quick to disfellowship over this issue is because they can't answer the question from before. Should the church be involved in this? And I think people who believe no or believe yes, they're so, well, since you don't believe, that we don't ride with each other. We don't grind with each other. Like, for example, some people who are Calvinist and Arminianist, like, because we don't have the same theology, we can't do work together. And I think that's where, like, I just naturally see is because they can't answer question number 3. This question is harder for people to wrestle with. And I think also I've talked to some pastors who struggle with this issue because they see it's such a hard task to overcome to address which one they should actually address or which one should they engage, that they're just like, you know what, instead of trying to figure this out, I'm just going to step away and disfellowship with anyone who does it because I don't understand. So I think that is something for me is they don't understand emotional maturity. At the same time, they just don't know how to answer the question before is it an obligation or should the church be engaged?
Yeah. Can I let me give my 2 cents and just say my problem is with certain kinds of people in the conversation. So I can chop it up with some first, but let me tell you the issue I have with like the more problematic folks like a Eric Mason. Okay, my problem with someone like that is when you begin to talk about the things that Christians do as gospel. When you begin to talk about the work that we do with people in society as gospel. Like I heard this other guy, I'm not going to keep name dropping. He said the gospel is vertical and horizontal. Now, if you say the gospel that is vertical has horizontal implications and consequences, I'm with you, bro. Yeah. But if you say the gospel of redemption is this broadness of what God does for us and what we do for God, you're preaching another gospel. So that's where I'm like, time out. I ain't with that. Y'all preach another gospel because you're defining reconciliation. You're defining redemption as the things that God does for us and the things that God does through us, which is a works righteousness. Now, if you want to talk about this, like this is what the gospel calls us to do in light of the redemption, then I understand. The other main issue I have and why I have a tension with certain folks, okay, is they're going back to the scriptures and they're making the narrative about Christ about our particular human narratives. For example, when someone like E. Mace, okay, goes to the Exodus story and he says that the Exodus story is about protests and black liberation and black issues in America. My mind, and y'all are Presby's, right? How dare you take the Exodus story that is about the greater Moses who brings us out of exile by him going to the Red Sea of God's judgment and coming out and bringing us with him, and to make that about you and your current contemporary narrative, bro. Like the scriptures are about Christ and what he does for his covenant people. It's not about us and our little particular contemporary human narratives. So for me personally, that's where I get real uncomfortable. It's not in saying the gospel calls us to this. It's in redefining the gospel and the very narratives of scripture to be about our works and our accomplishments and our narratives. That's where I'm like, yo, we got a problem here. Time out. What's up? Like, ¿qué pasó? You know what I'm saying? That's why it's hard for me to engage with certain folks.
And I think this is also going to be one of the reasons why you'll see disfellowship is because when you have an entire people, the black community who have been enslaved, who have been oppressed by Christians, and yet what did they cling on to as their hope? They clung on to the gospel narrative as revealed through the Exodus. And so in a sense, taking that scripture away from an entire people group who's known slavery. I mean, a lot of us as Latinos have not. You know, I mean, that I know of, you know, we were not subject to, you know, slavery as blacks were, as our black brothers and sisters. And so some of the disfellowship can come because we don't hurt with the rest of the body when they hurt, because we tell the rest of the body, hey, get over it. And so sometimes those things are basically ways of saying that part of the gospel, it's not for you. You're doing it wrong. In a sense, it's almost telling a people group like that. It's telling them, hey, I know that story gave you hope, but it shouldn't have. Step off of it. And there's a whole identity, you know, on blacks that are built through the Exodus. You know, I mean, you look at like the story of Harriet Tubman. I mean, right? She was basically nicknamed Moses, you know, and I mean, not to say that, you know, they were saying that she was the actual Moses or even the greater deliverer, but she was in that long line of people that God used to deliver people, you know, from real and actual slavery. I mean, you know, it's not a spiritual slavery merely that the Israelites were under in Egypt. They were under real oppression. And so that's one of the things that I think we have to be careful for. I mean, you know, yes, can a person go too far with the scripture? I mean, sure, you know, but I think we have to be careful too. I mean, there's some history, you know, when people use a narrative like that, you know, and they want to cling on to the hope that scripture brings of real freedom. And they look forward. I mean, you look at the black spirituals too. I mean, you know, they're doused with scripture, and they're always very eschatological. They're always forward looking for deliverance. I mean, even, you know, so Bapo, I mean, you mentioned Justo Gonzalez, his book Mañana, you know, he mentions that Latinos are a people of Mañana because we're always the people who cling on to the hope that is to come. You know, so I think that's where we have to be careful too, you know, where we have to learn how to respect and, you know, I guess going back to what Joel said, you know, that empathic listening, you know, they're reading off of Keller. We have to learn to have that, or else, you know, again, you know, we're going to be bringing the disfellowship with us.
But I think listening, like, what is, I can empathize with anyone really. If someone sits there and tells me their story and tells me what they've been through, I understand and I can empathize with them. I think like all human beings, we can do that. As Christians, we can definitely do that. Empathize with those that are hurting. But at what point is it going too far when we start internalizing everything we read because it perhaps means something to us at that moment, even though it's not the exact intention of the text. And I feel like that's where it can get dangerous, because then we start reading ourselves into every scripture, into every story, into every passage.
Mm-hmm.
Not that that's inherently wrong to want to have hope based on
the gospel,
a story, right, that's in scripture. But at what point do we say, well, perhaps this sounds really romantic and really good, but this is a totally different redemption story. Like it's a different thing, you know. And I feel like that when I was in a Pentecostal church, or a Pentecostal for many years, that's a lot of the ways that I dealt with things. I took certain stories, certain things of the scripture, and I internalized it and made it personal for me, so that I can somehow understand or get through whatever I was going through. But it wasn't until I actually placed my hope in the promise of the gospel that I will go through these things, that I will experience certain things, that I will have these heartaches and these injustices. And not they say they're okay. I'm not playing a blanket over it. I'm saying that the hope of the gospel to me is a much better hope than anything that the government can perhaps give me as far as reparations or anything like that. Like it's this hope that one day all things will be made new. And I'll say one more thing about that. A lot of people don't know. A lot of people don't know that in Puerto Rico we experienced a lot of bombings in the island of Vieques. Vieques is a small little island off the offshore of Puerto Rico. And the bombings were so catastrophic. It was actually the U.S. Air Force Base doing practice runs, and they would bomb the shore of the island about maybe 2 or 3 miles from the shore. And the radiation was so bad that a lot of women in Vieques, they had issues having children. Cancer was rampant, and a lot of stuff is really unknown. Like no one really knows about it. And I say that to say that although it's a difficult story, it's a difficult narrative. This is the partiality that I mean that takes place a lot in this conversation. It's always about one specific sector of the conversation. And if we're going to talk about partiality or racism, why don't we include all sectors of it and have that kind of conversation versus just a particular group or a particular people who went through a particular situation, if that makes any sense. And I'm not saying there's no empathy to be had, there's no love to be had, because I don't think anybody in this room feels any kind of prejudice towards anybody in our, Black or Latino or whatever. I think we all have empathy towards anyone who goes through things. But I mean, if we're going to stay consistent with the conversation. Yeah.
All right, guys, we have 2.5 minutes. Okay.
Yeah. And Vapo, you look like you wanted to say something, so I'm going to let you respond.
Lots of thoughts. But one of them, Aldo, I kind of want to hear your thoughts in regards to what you mentioned about E. Mason offline, because I know it's a whole different discussion. Because what I've seen sometimes with him, he's engaging more Black Hebrew Israelites who have the mentality of, the African Americans in America is the Egyptian slaves in that correlation tie. So I was kind of intrigued to just kind of want to talk that offline. But I do agree with Mr. Dominguez in regards to I think we can sympathize with people who see themselves in scriptures. But I think of true biblical, healthy, doctrinal, orthodoxy, orthopraxy, education, teaching helps them to see, because Exodus might be enticing or the story of Joseph might be enticing, but like Aldo said, it's the gospel that truly is the salvation.
Say that, bro.
And I agree with you with that. But at the same time, I will also argue that I think what we need to wrestle with at times is, what do we do as a church in light of the gospel, in light of the gospel reconciliation, the restoration of all things? I agree. Yes, there's a kingdom hope, a focus that all things will be made new. But in the time that we're in now, what can we do with this gospel of hope and light to go and bring this to people who are broken, disheartened, disenchanted? And I think through race and social issues at times will allow us to have bridge, because I think there's a lot of people who have no hope, have no direction, who are on this train trying to understand how to engage in race and social issues. And I agree with Aldo, you first bring the gospel, but then you bring the implications of the gospel to address those issues. So I don't think sometimes the organization of the church should be detached from engaging with people, engaging with issues. I think the worldview that we have been blessed with, that we get to have, is what we get to bring and challenge people with.
And I think really quick, but one of the things is that the church has a history of saying, let's just preach the gospel, worry about your soul and the greater deliverance. In the meantime, you're going to keep those chains on you. And yes, you're baptized. Okay. And this is, these were, laws in 1640 something, right? But, you know, it was told to the slaves, yes, you're a Christian now. Yes, you're baptized, but you're still going to remain a slave. And so the church has a history of basically doing this whole, let's just preach the gospel to you. Worry about your soul, but your body is mine. And there's nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I add that when we generalize the church did this, we need to be reminded that not the atheists, but fellow believers were involved in the emancipation of the slavery in this country. And you look at Great Britain, they didn't go through a civil war. However, the people who were responsible for eliminating slavery in the empire were Christians. They were Calvinists, actually. So I think we need to be balanced when we say the church only did this and that's it. And no. There's a balance. There's a balance.
Agree.
Yeah, I never said the church only did that.
Yeah, John Newton was involved, and Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a Calvinist, and so yeah.
Here's a 20 second.
The church has done some good with the issue of slavery and did some bad stuff too.
Here's a 20-second soundbite. If you look at church history, a lot of the people that justified slavery were not people that were arguing for the spirituality of the church. They were actually
Robert Dabney, James Henry Thornwell.
Look, anybody can find somebody. You know what I'm saying? Like you can find somebody that saw something, but I'm talking about like in the generations of the church, it was the people that had a politicized view of God's kingdom. America is a new Israel, and we are a new theocracy. And guess what? Old Testament Israel had slaves. It was the politicized one kingdom, socialized takeover countries folk that were using scriptures to justify slavery. And it was the folks that were saying, yo, we are not of this world. We are a different empire. We are the new covenant community that were charging that. So I think a lot of the people actually that were promoting slavery were not gospel guys. Okay, no. They were theonomist guys. Okay, now obviously that term didn't exist then.
Yeah,
but the mentality. Okay, we are the new Israel, and Israel had slaves, and Israel had all this stuff, and it was the gospel guys.
Yeah. We're not talking about
that was like, nah, man. It was the gospel guys that was doing church discipline on them folks. You know what I'm saying? So I think that there's a lot of narratives that I think are kind of collapsed together about who are these people that were like, quote unquote gospel guys who use gospel centrality to justify slavery. There's a whole lot more to that conversation.
Yeah,
we're not doing church history here. I guess we're just